Hi, and welcome to Java Programming Skills Using Replit. I'm Norman McIntyre. Let's get started. Here we're going to look at System.in, System.out, and System.err. I think you'll find this pretty cool, pretty interesting, so let's get to it. So here we are on our opening application that says Hello World. And from the very beginning, we've been using System.out to send information out. Turns out there's two others, though, you can use. I'm going to do System.err, so System.err, and say print line. I'll say hello, and it's often called stderr. And since this one, we'll change it from saying hello world, let's say stdout. So when you run an application, you can either send output to standard output, or you can send it to stderr. Now I find there's a lot of confusion about what does this really mean from a programming perspective, so we're going to find out. And this is a case where using the command line makes everything super clear. So that's what we'll do here. We know that I can type Java main from the command line, and no surprise, right? I mean, you're saying, well, hello stdout and hello stderr. But when you look at it, you say, well, I mean, what's the difference, standard output versus stderr? Well, the idea is you as a software developer, your normal output, things that are just part of your standard program flow, should go to standard output. And things that are error conditions should go to stderr. And of course, when we run our program here, you look at it and you say, well, I don't know the difference. How can you tell one versus the other? But here's what you can do from the Linux command line. And we know from uname we're running on a Linux system. So here's what we can do. Let me clear the screen. We can do this. We can say Java main, and of course by default, both stdout and stderr come on the screen like we see here. But suppose you were having lots of output and you only wanted to capture standard output. You wanted to basically capture that into a file. We could say Java main, redirect the output. So the greater than sign says redirect the output, and we'll just call a file, let's call it stdout.txt. You can call it anything you want to, but just for purposes here, I'm going to say redirect standard output into this file. And when you press enter, notice that we only see on the screen the stderr. We didn't see anything come from standard output. Why? Because it was redirected into this file. In fact, we can use the cat command to concatenate that file, and sure enough, there it is. It says hello stdout. So a key skill here is you can redirect your output to a file. Well, if you can redirect standard output, I wonder if we can redirect stderr. And the answer is we can, but first I'm going to redirect to standard output again using a slightly different syntax. I'm going to do one greater than stdout.txt. And notice same thing, we don't see any standard output up here, we just see standard out or stderr. But if I say cat stdout.txt, we see the same thing again. This is a shorthand because it knows that in most cases you're redirecting into what's called standard output, which is actually is called a file descriptor 1. Just very briefly, it turns out 0 is standard in, 1 is standard out, and 2 is stderr. Now, these are at they're actually called file descriptors, and they determine where you're either getting input or sending output to. And in fact, as I said here, this will by default, since this is the most common one, it's actually doing this, which is redirecting to standard output. Well, that means if we could do that, we could also redirect the stderr by saying Java main 2, which is stderr, redirect that, and I'll just call it stderr.txt. And check that out. We've actually got it now where all our errors, everything that went to the error, go into this file, and so I can cat stderr.txt, and sure enough, we've got it. So super cool to know that you can redirect your standard output. You can also redirect the stderr. In fact, let me clear the screen. We know that by default, So I go here to my default case. Both stderr and stdout come to the screen. We said though we can redirect to stdout, and that way you'll only see the stderr come to the screen, or we can redirect, and again you can call this file name anything you want to. I'm just calling it stderr and stdout for purposes here. And of course, oftentimes at this point, someone will ask, well, can you redirect both of them? Can you redirect them both to a file? You bet. Java main. Let's first redirect the standard output. Oh, let's call this both.txt. All right, so that takes care of that. And then let's go to the stderr output, and we use this special syntax. So take stderr and send it, how you like that, to stdout. And this is a pretty cool thing, because notice nothing came to our screen. Nothing at all came to our screen, and instead it went to this file called both. So pretty cool skills how you can redirect that. So that takes care of stderr and stdout. Let's do this. System.out.println. Let's say press enter to continue. All right. Well, it turns out we can do System.in, and it has a method called read. And in fact, we'll read from that, and then we'll do System.out.println. Let's say, how about all done? Now, notice we got a red line here, and in fact, when I position my cursor, we know the red line tells you you've got an error condition. It says unhandled exception of type IO exception. Now, we haven't talked about exceptions yet, but an exception is something that happens out of the ordinary. And let's just ignore that error and go ahead and click on run. And of course, we'll get another error. We know this is a syntax error. It says main.java line number 6, right there, unreported exception, IO exception, must be caught or declared to be thrown. Now, we have not covered this, but often the way I do these videos is when we get thrown into a situation, well, it's time to learn how to do that. And by this one, you see we've got a choice, must be caught or declared to be thrown. So it sounds like we got two different options there. Let's try the must be caught. Here's what we can do. And this is new stuff. We've not seen this before. There's a syntax within Java language called try, T-R-Y. Open curly brace. And what this says is try to do this. Now, an exception is if you try to do something and it doesn't work. Well, here we're putting it inside of here. But if it doesn't work, notice it says must be caught. Well, what that means, we can say catch. And what we're catching, notice it tells us right here, unreported exception, IO exception. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to put IO exception. And this is the data type, IO exception. I'll just call this EX. So this will be our variable that holds this. And if this should occur, I'll just say system.out.println. Oh, let's print out the value of the exception if that should happen. Now, again, I want you to notice I've got some errors here. In fact, when I position over there, it says IO exception cannot be resolved. Cannot be resolved. So that means right now the Java compiler doesn't understand where this is coming from. Well, let's go ahead and click on run, even though we know we're going to get an error. Let's see what kind of information we get here. And it says, sure enough, it cannot find this symbol, IO exception. It cannot find it. So it says, you know, you asked me to use this and I don't know what it is. Now, you could do a Google search on the web and look it up. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and put java.io.io exception. It turns out Java.io is a package, and we haven't talked about packages yet, but we need to know a little bit about packages right now. A package is a namespace. It's a way of putting classes inside a package that have similar functionality. Well, you can imagine if you have a package called java.io, then it must deal with I/O. And by the way, I/O is input output. So this must deal with input output. And sure enough, inside of there is a class called I/O exception. So by doing this, we're actually going to standard input, and we're going to try to read something. We don't care what we're going to read because we're just wanting you to press enter. So we're really throwing away whatever we read. We could say we care less. We just want to read something. And then once we read it, we'll continue on. Now, if something would happen, we would get an exception here, which we will not. I mean, we're just reading. You press the enter key. So I'll click on run. And here we go. We see hello standard out, hello standard error. Press enter to continue. And notice how my cursor is down here under the line. I probably would like to have it at the end of the line here. So before I do anything else, I'll click on stop. And I'll come over here and say, how about let's just do, instead of a print line, let's just do a print on this one. Click on run. Okay, press enter to continue. So if I press enter, or sometimes it's the return key, sometimes it's labeled enter, sometimes return, but if you press that key, how you like that? All done. Let's run it again. Now, if I come here and I press A, B, C, D, right? Well, it's waiting. It's just sitting there. And as soon as I press enter, then it continues on. So it's the pressing the enter, pressing the continue key that makes it continue on. So at this point in this set of videos, you now understand how to use stdout, stderr, and we've seen in essence the bare minimum way to use stdin. As you can imagine, there's a lot more ways to use stdin, but this gets us going for this initial skill. So thanks again. You've made it this far. You're making great progress. There's still more to come in the next video. I'm Norman McIntyre. Thanks as always for watching.